happened to you.
Yes.
I know, thank you. No.
Not sure what
Sort of chained to the desk.
You can.
See that.
Are we not? And then we can direct them to communicate that back out to them.
Yeah.
I'll be gone and he'll so smart.
Make it easy.
Shame on you. I'll be gone.
Okay.
Oh, gosh. I was so deep in discussions, I forgot that we had gone past our starting
What
time.
time are we supposed to start?
So we had 2 minutes of grace.
We all need grace.
Extended. Yeah. Yes. Okay, board members, advisors, staff, audience. We're now back to resume our committee meetings. So the first committee we'll turn to is Education, Innovation, and Charter Schools Committee, and want to turn it over to our new chairman, Ms. White. So please take over. Proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Comey. I am Amy White, and along with Mr. Wayne McDevitt, we do chair the Education, Innovation, and Charter Schools Committee. Before we go over the items on the agenda today, I do just want to take a point of personal privilege to thank Ms. Becky Taylor for her 5 years of service in serving on this committee. As you know, our changes in our state statute have allowed for the widespread expansion of charter schools across our great state, and Ms. Taylor has been an advocate for school choice in our state and has worked directly with lawmakers, with the Charter School Advisory Board to make sure that we provide excellent opportunities for students as we prepare our nation's leaders. So thank you, Ms. Taylor. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have one action item on the agenda, and this is EICS 1, Raleigh Oak Charter Schools request to change its originally approved enrollment. Raleigh Oak Charter experienced a high number of applicants, and additional students will allow the school to address the financial need to afford the facility that they're in. So they're requesting not only an increase in enrollment, but also that they be allowed to open as a K-4, not a K-3 school as originally approved. That'll come before us tomorrow on our action agenda, and we did hear about that last month. Does anybody have a question? Hearing none. We do have 3 items for action on first read that we'll cover tomorrow. The first is EICS 2, the voluntary relinquishment of the charter of Padilla Academy in Cabarrus County. Padilla had already received a 1-year delay in opening, and in May of this year, Padilla submitted a formal request to relinquish that charter, and that request is before us this month for action on first read. I've got Dave Machado here to answer any questions, if need be. Okay. EICS 3 is the amendment and rescinding of the restart applications. I know Dr. Nancy Barber's on hand if we have questions for that, but this is a request from Washington County Schools to rescind its application for the restart model at Pines Elementary School, and the reason cited was because of the county's lack of ability to fully fund that model. So they're asking that that application be rescinded. Anybody have a question there? Moving on to EICS 4, the Innovative School District Criminal Background Check Policy and Process. Dr. Eric Hall is going to come forward and talk to us about this if you have any questions. Because the ISD is set up as a separate LEA, a new policy regarding background checks needed to be put in place. Normally, a new policy would not be on action on first read, but this particular policy is a direct reflection and aligns directly with existing DPI policies for all of the rest of the state and its LEAs, and so we're bringing it to you on first read so that we can help Dr. Hall make the hires that he needs to make. Okay. Anybody have a question there? You guys are making this so easy on me. Thank you. I told you. Baptize me by there are 13 items on my agenda. I was a little bit nervous. Mr. McDevitt. Yes, sir.
Are we going to get another shot at him?
We are. I'm bringing him back.
That was a terrible way to put it, Eric.
13.
I really was, the context of that was there were a number of legislative changes, and those aren't on the agenda. I know we have a legislative report, but you would know deeper in the weeds about the legislative pieces. So, Amy, I just say, whenever you think it's appropriate, it'd be nice to be able to get some clarity from him relative to legislative changes, unless you're going to do that as part of tomorrow's legislative report.
I think he's planning to give you a pretty broad scale update on progress that's been made with ISD and some of the things that he's working on to make sure that perhaps our leadership or leadership in that position.
It's 13, as part of 13. Good,
yes,
thanks.
sir. Thank you. Okay, that being, anybody have any other questions for all the items that we've discussed so far? Great. Let's move on to EICS 5, which is the first item under for discussion, and this is Healthy Start Education, Inc.'s request to transfer its charter to another nonprofit entity. So this is a situation where there are two schools that have been operating under one operating board, and the schools, because of their reapplication process, have decided that they would separate to focus more on some of, to increase their achievement. So the schools are going to separate and create two separate corporations. One will be Healthy Start Academy, and the other will be Research Triangle Charter Academy, Inc. This will create two separate entities, and Dave Machado is here to answer and sort of discuss this issue with you.
One of the reasons that they're proposing to do this is during the renewal process for Healthy Start, that was one of the discussions with the Charter School Advisory Board, where they could possibly have two individual boards so they could spend a little more attention on each individual school. So that's why they're asking for that. So RTCA Inc. will be the nonprofit for Research Triangle Charter Academy, and Healthy Start Education Inc. will remain the entity that holds the charter for Healthy Start School, and Research Triangle Academy will continue its partnership with National Heritage Association.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Machado. Let's see, I think you will be standing there for quite a bit this afternoon, so just hang on. So EICS 6 is the recommended changes for the Charter Schools Performance Framework. This is a recommendation to make needed changes to the framework which captures school data trends each year, and these changes include a section for reporting school results under an alternative accountability model. Dr. Machado.
Right. We do currently have 3 alternative charter schools in our portfolio, and they were approved to have an alternative accountability model, and there is no place to capture that in our performance framework. So CSAP is recommending that we add that as a D17 item. This school will continue to get a letter grade for their federal score, but as far as their state score, we will put in their approved accountability model and how they compare to what they said they were going to do.
See a question, Dr.
I have
Oxendine?
yes, thank you. Ms. White, help me understand, well, let me just ask the straightforward question. What makes those 3 schools seems to me like a charter is an alternative. So what else makes it those schools alternative? Is it their curriculum, perhaps?
These are our 3 dropout prevention schools, so that's why.
I see.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much. EICS 7 is the final ready to open recommendations for charter schools opening in 2018. As you know, we have a very rigorous process to help prepare new charter schools prepare for opening, and we're working on that for August of 2018. So the schools that are before you for discussion today are the 14 that have been through the ready to open process, and they are before you for discussion.
Okay. And on that list, one of the schools has asked for a 1-year delay, and that is Anson Charter Academy. So you'll only be approving 13 schools at your next meeting. Several of these schools will be coming in front of the Charter School Advisory Board on Monday to give them an update on where they are in their enrollment status and their facility status. So you'll get a recommendation from CSAB at your July meeting.
Questions? Thanks. All right, EICS 8 is the recommended changes to CHTR-016, the charter school fast track replication policy. And the CSAB has done some pretty extensive work and to propose amendments to current school board policy CHTR-016 to more closely align to the intent of General Statute 115C-218.3. And these changes are being made to provide better clarity to fast-track replication applicants. If that is a mouthful for you, these are schools that are held as models that we and CSAB would deem as appropriate for replicating in other cities. And trying to make sure we have a process in place to make sure that they align. Mr. Machado.
As Ms. White mentioned, the reason for the proposals to these changes is so there's just more clarity on what a fast-track replication is, and clarity to the applicants, and a better line with general statute. The first change is the definition of what a model is and what the definition of replication. Believe it or not, those definitions were reversed in the old policy, and obviously a model is what the school does. It's their academic performance, their governance performance, what makes a school want to be good enough to be replicated, and the replication is just the copying of that good model. So that's the first change. The second change is adding fast track to this verbiage right here so our applicants understand the difference between fast track replication and replication, okay? And for a school to be able to be replicated, there's criteria that they have to meet, and one is they have to have academic outcomes that are comparable to their local LEA. And CSAB is also recommending that we add, and they also, or they meet or exceed growth for the 3 years prior to the application process. So that is a change. And change number 4 is just adding the word to make that sentence grammatically correct. Okay, and then the final change is Section B talks about a nonprofit corporation that manages a school out of the state. So the need to have the word language in North Carolina in there wasn't consistent with the policy. So and that is being removed from the policy also.
Okay. Any questions about that?
How many fast-track schools or fast-track replications have we had up to this point? Fast-track meaning they don't have to go through a planning year?
Correct.
Is that right?
The only one that I'm aware of, and Dr. Tom Smith might be able to help me, is Cardinal Charter. You approved that last year, and they're actually going to be asking for a 1-year delay. So I'd say the only.
So we've had 0 that have actually
Fast
taken
track.
advantage of
We've
that.
had several replication requests. Movement in Charlotte is replicating Sugar Creek in Charlotte, but as far as the fast track, that's the only one that I'm aware of since I've been here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's another tool in the toolbox. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, any questions that need to be resolved on this one? Okay, great. All right, so the next one is EICS 9, and this is actually a new policy recommendation for charter school support and management organizations. And this is a new policy that's being proposed by CSAB to provide greater clarity and transparency in the charter school application process as it pertains to charter school management and support organizations. And basically CSAB is putting this in place because they felt like they needed to better qualify and define the terms management organization and charter support organization. In addition, the policy will require that charter schools receive approval from the State Board of Education before partnering with or terminating any existing partnership in a management organization. So this is new, and I'm sure you're going to give some highlights on that.
During the application process, we've seen over the last couple of years that there's more and more third-party entities that are helping the application process. And we certainly think that that is appropriate. To fill out an application is a very rigorous process, and we obviously would like as many independent, what we call mom and pop charter schools, in our portfolio. A lot of them are seeking help, And we wanted, CSAP wanted to make sure that that was clearly disclosed during the application process and be very transparent. So that the purpose of this policy is to define what a management organization is, and then to define what a charter support organization, which is new to our language in the Office of Charter School. And it will require, as it has in the past, that if a school is going to partner with a management company, they must get state board approval. If they're going to separate from a management company, they must get state board approval. And now we're asking that if somebody's going to partner with a charter support organization, that be disclosed at the application process. We're not interested, once a school, or the CSAB is not interested, once a school becomes a charter school and they want to partner with somebody to provide other services, we're not asking for that information. We just want it to be disclosed in the application process. And the definition of a CMO is the same definition we've been using for years. That's a nonprofit organization that helps manage a school. An EMO is a for-profit organization, and that is the federally recognized definition. And again, what we're talking about now is a charter support organization. This is a for-profit or nonprofit, non-governmental entity that's going to provide assistance during the application process. It could be writing it, it could be writing their education plan, it could be talking about their governance, or a technical assistance to operate the school. Again, we support the help, but we want to make sure that the Charter School Advisory Board is aware of who is helping them, and is there any agreement that has been made with the school once they become a charter. They might say, we're going to write this application for you free, but you must use our services for governance training, or you must use our services for whatever. We want to make sure if that is what the case is, CSAB is aware of it and can make their decision based on that information. Again, these are the disclosures that we talked about earlier that are required, that have been required in State Board Policy CHTR 014. And then, again, if somebody's going to partner with a charter support organization, it just needs to be disclosed at the application process. And one thing that State Board approved during your charter school timeline, application timeline, that if any applicant is cut and pasting from another applicant, a previous applicant, that has to be disclosed also in the application. You approved that at the last meeting when we talked about our timeline. And I think that's another very good improvement to the process. And I applaud Charter School Advisory Board for recommending this policy.
Ms. Taylor?
Yeah, I just want to say I'm very pleased that the CSAB is bringing this forward for the same reasons that you said. I mean, and if we are encouraging strong mom pops, you know, strong educators that we know that want to start a charter school, we want to hear from them, and we want to know what they can do and what they plan to do. And as long as there's transparency and they say, I'm having this particular group doing this for us, we need to know that. Are they writing an application? And, you know, that's very important. So I really appreciate this coming forward.
Ms. Willoughby?
I agree. I think this is a good change, and I wonder if we could also have something similar to what we have in our contracts process, where there's, in addition to the contract that we're looking at, there is a year-to-date amount that that particular company has been paid. With this, I wonder if some of the supporting information could be either how many or a list of the other charter schools that are supported by or working with or have applications, application assistance, I guess, by. I think that might be helpful long-term, you know, that might be good data to have.
That's a great point. We can get that.
Okay.
Any other questions from my colleagues about this? Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. All right, EICS 10 is Thomas Academy's proposal to become an alternative charter school, and this is from a school that's located on the campus of the Boys and Girls Home at Lake Waccamaw. They're seeking to become an alternative charter school with alternative accountability status.
This school does meet the criteria for being an alternative school according to State Board Policy CHTR 20. They are a high school. and they do serve both residential and community students, and they do serve high-risk students. So they came before the CSAB because of their low performance, and CSAB has known what their population is. They made the recommendation that you might want to look into becoming an alternative charter school. This has been a long process. Our office has helped them through that application process, and they finally were able to get it to us, and they want to start that next fall.
Questions there? Hearing none, we'll move on to EICS 11, which is Union Day Charter Schools request to relocate. And this is actually a success story. They've been in a temporary facility for 2 years, and they have found a permanent facility. And so now that they've secured that permanent location, they have submitted a request to the board for formal relocation.
For a charter school to move more than 5 miles from their original site, it does take state board approval. They're moving about 10 miles away, 15-minute drive is what they're telling us. It is still in the same area of Union County that their application said they would serve, and they do provide transportation and will keep the transportation system that they have in place.
When do they intend to relocate?
Excuse me?
For the fall?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
When do they intend to relocate?
Oh, yes, in August of 2018.
Is there any reason, Madam Chair, that we shouldn't move that one and give them from discussion over to action?
I'll defer to Mr. Machado.
It would make them feel better and give them some a comfort, but yes, I see no reason not to.
Without objection, we'll make it action on first read.
There's nothing hidden there. It's just straightforward, isn't it? Yeah.
Right. Exactly. That's it. In the question about the virtual charter school class size, I wasn't able to get hold of either one of the leaders, but statute says K-8, the limit is 1 teacher per 50 students, and in 9-12 it's 1 for 150. But I do have calls out to both virtual charter schools to find out what their class size is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Machado, for hanging with us for all of those items. We'll move on to EICS 12, and this is our restart application submission. Nancy Barber will come before us today. We've got 2 schools that have submitted restart applications: Elizabeth City Middle and P.W. Moore Elementary School.
Thank you, Ms. White. Good afternoon. You do have 2 applications before you that our team will be reviewing over the next month to bring back next month for consent and approval. Are there any questions? Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, and the final item for today's discussion is EICS number 13, Innovative School District updates to start up at Southside Ashpole Elementary School and the hiring processes for educators and school support staff inside the memorandum of understanding. And Dr. Eric Hall is going to give us an update and answer any questions that you might have about work that's been done with members of our General Assembly to make good things happen. Dr. Hall.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, Chairman Kobe, Vice Chairman Davis, Superintendent Johnson, members of the board, the advisory, and the citizens of North Carolina. So a lot's happened since last month. If you recall, we signed a contract with an operator, and since that time we have been moving full speed ahead and getting ready to start up and open the doors at Southside Ashpole Elementary. Our first day of school is scheduled for August 27th, and we have staff starting and reporting on August 6th with additional pre-service training and things that will help get us ready for the opening of our first school in the ISD. So with that, over the last several weeks, what we've been doing is working first and foremost with the existing personnel at the school, engaging in interview processes, trying to identify those that want to continue to remain at the school. And we will wrap up all of those interviews and processes and decisions by the end of this week with staff at the school that will be remaining and going with us into next year. At the same time, we've had other recruitment activities because there are some existing vacancies regardless that we're going to be at the school. We've seen some situations where there's been long-term subs, some classrooms where some individuals had decided beforehand that they were not going to be returning next year. So we knew automatically that there were going to be some vacancies that we would have to fill. So with that, we've been very fortunate to continue our strong partnership with the town of Roland. We had a job fair just a few weeks ago there in town. The mayor actually opened up the town hall and allowed us to use her personal office for interviewing. and engaging what I thought was a very good, strong, healthy turnout. And we've been fortunate in the sense that we've been able to expand and really extend our recruitment efforts, not just in North Carolina, but even down into South Carolina as far as Florence because of where the school is located. If you're ever down that way and you're on I-95, if you get off exit 2, you will find Roland. And so, you know, we're really close to the landmark. For those of you that know south of the border and the Big Sombrero, we can see it off in the skyline almost. So it's a great town. It's a great community. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but this is part of a strategy of how do we expand our recruitment efforts to put the team in place for the first year of operations as we get ready to start next school year. With that, we've used also online resources, advertising, and everything that you could think of that any other LEA would do to try to recruit and bring personnel to the table. We are at a point where we are hoping and working with the operator to finalize the selection of a school leader. We do have one piece that we are working with in hopes with the General Assembly that we'll get a provision that clarifies an element around the school leader's ability to access retirement and state benefits, because we know that that would definitely be a barrier in the recruitment effort. And the way that the law is currently written, it does look like because they're an employee of the operator, that is a piece that we need to go forward and get some clarity for with the General Assembly. And so I will continue to keep you updated, and we have hopes that we'll be able to get some resolution to that here before the session ends. Another update is that as we're working with the public schools of Robeson County, we are finalizing an MOU that helps to identify the services, the supports, and this partnership in what we'll be doing together over the next 5 years. The MOU that's been developed, very grateful to both Mr. Weber and Mr. Snyder, the school board attorneys, as we've worked through this MOU process for things like child nutrition services, transportation services, facility and grounds maintenance, IT and network services, you know, things that sometimes we don't think about when you go into a school. There's existing networks. You've got to navigate things with the FCC around things like E-rate and how do we utilize those tools inside the building. And then looking at the funding and other shared services that we'll have in place with the district. And I have to say, it has been a very, what I would say, a very smooth, collaborative process. And I think the good news is in this situation that between the district, the local school board, and the ISD, that partnership continues to remain strong. And we're all learning as we're going into this, but the good news is that everybody's been willing partners in this learning process, and everybody continues to remain committed to the students and to the staff that will be at Southside Asheville. Some other updates that I would anticipate relate to the legislative process and where we are so far in this session. One thing that I will report that in the budget bill that came out, we did find a provision, and I know this was something that had come up in discussion earlier this year as we were going through operator selection, is a provision that does allow now the ISD to be an operator. That was put in the budget bill, and that is there so that going forward, whether we, if we find a situation where we don't have a slate of operators that meet expectations for what we're trying to accomplish, or if we have an operator that we have to consider different options for going forward, this gives us the ability to be agile. My first step, of course, is always to make sure we find good, strong, operators and partners that we work with, and we see great success, and I'm confident we will do that. But this does give us the ability, which I know was important to the board, on how we can be agile going forward when we need to be. Another part of that was that we were hopeful to get at least some degree of expansion funding, and I know funding is a hot topic and something that is a challenge that all of us face in today's environment, and trying to find as many resources as we can. But where it was critically important to us as the ISD is that just like every other LEA, we have to do our own financial management. We have to administer our own payroll systems. We have to have our own HR systems in place because while, yes, we're the ISD and we report to the state board and we're part of DPI, there are some things that are very different between Chapter 115C, which defines LEA employees, versus 126 that defines the employees working for a state agency. So we're having to navigate that, and those are some things that, as we go forward, will continue to be something that is an operational element of the ISD as the 116th district, and something that we will hope as we go forward we'll find some additional resources over time to be able to really expand our support of those systems and processes in operating in LEA. As of yesterday, in the House K-12 committee, there were some additional amendments that were brought forward for discussion, and I will give an overview, and maybe that will be an opportunity to generate some questions, and maybe, Mr. McDevitt, maybe I'll actually answer some of the questions in this discussion, but if not, I know we'll continue the conversation. One of the first things that came up in the House bill that was actually put through as a deletion in the existing statute, it's the reference to the reform models. If you recall, there was a piece in the statute that said schools that qualify, if they had adopted a reform model for the immediate prior year, they basically were exempt from consideration. And I'd like to give you a rationale as to why I think that deletion is actually something that helps to lift up all schools. When we have a restart school, a turnaround school, a transformation school, those are all part of the chapter that defines a state-established reform model. But what that does, and I learned this last year going out and meeting with districts and meeting with schools, some of which, were thinking about adopting one of these models, but had other models that they also wanted to adopt. If we think about the whole child model, for example, if a district is adopting that as a strategy to help improve outcomes in their school, there's nothing that prohibits them from being considered. And at the same time, they may not want to do a restart. They may not want to do a turnaround, or they may not want to do a transformation. What this does is creates options for districts to innovate and for us to encourage innovation across the board without feeling like they have to adopt a particular model in this particular situation. And what it does do is it creates a situation where we have accountability on all schools to do well, not just accountability on the ISD, but as we work hand in hand with educator support services in their division, monitor schools, see schools that are making progress, but making sure that if an application comes before this board for approval, going back to some of the conversations I heard earlier about implementation, that it's a plan that's being implemented well and one that's supporting the staff and the students inside that school to drive the kind of outcomes that we want to see for students in all low-performing schools across the state. So it's an opportunity to open opportunity and possibility, but also puts the onus on the ISD to come before this board with a rationale and an explanation for why any school that we consider and why we think it's important to be engaged in that conversation for qualification with the school, regardless of a reform model or a locally led district initiative. An additional piece, and there's a few pieces that were brought forward yesterday. Another part is modifying timeframes and timelines. We learned a lot in the first year, and sometimes the timelines were very short, and sometimes we didn't have the runway, and that's what we're dealing with right now, to be candid. We are moving quickly to get a team in place, get our implementation plan in place for opening the school next school year. When we think about the following year and opening 2 more schools at least, we need as much runway as we can to be prepared. So there are some accommodations now within the provisions that look at those timelines. Another component that was mentioned is that I think everybody's aware that we have a cap of 5 schools that we can consider during this process. Well, that means next year, not this coming fall, but the following fall, we will have all 5 schools selected. What that does is that going forward for the following 2 years and this first 5 years, there's absolutely no process of anything that would allow the board to consider any additional schools for consideration. We would run a list of schools that qualify, but there would be no possibility of selection. To me, the provision that makes sure that we are accountable for this work is that we would have to make sure that the schools that we're working with, this first school especially, by that time period, has a letter grade of at least a C in order for us to consider any more schools. And it's permissive language. It's not mandatory language to select 2 more schools. It says that the board may select an additional 2 schools per year if we meet this other criteria. And so what that does is, again, gives the board the opportunity to say if we see schools that need additional intervention and support, it gives us the opportunity to engage in a way that continues to keep students at the center of what we need to do to drive outcomes in schools that persistently have been low performing for too long. Another provision, and we heard this early on as we were working with the teachers at the school, and it deals with career status. Because we are the 116th LEA, back in 2013, you may remember when career status or tenure changed for teachers. Well, there's a provision that you're grandfathered into where if you're a teacher in an LEA and you have career status, you can maintain that if you had it before 2013 as long as you're in your local district and you do not change. But if you went from one district to the other, that did not transfer with you. So if we think about good teachers in a school that we want to work with and continue to engage and to be partners with and support, what would happen is that that status would completely end by the time they became employees of the ISD, even though they could be sitting in the same school, in the same district, and everything else. So we asked for a provision that allowed for career status to be reinstated upon their transfer back into the local school system. That way, that was not an opportunity that was lost for them, and it did not hurt our ability to recruit the talent that we know we need to build within these schools and to do the things that we want to do to support both educators and deliver to the students the services that we're going to bring forward. Another part, and again, I'm going to keep saying another part because there's a lot of lessons learned that drove some of these conversations, but we learned this first year that one of the options that a district has once approved by the state board for selection is an opportunity to either transfer the school or to close the school. Well, that is a big decision to close a school, in my opinion. The impact to staff in that school, the impact to that community, and the impact to students. So there was a provision that was put in place in this bill that requires some type of report back to the State Board of Education about the impact of that closure on that local community, particularly what will happen to the students, where would they be placed, is there a risk they'll be placed in other low-performing schools, and what happens to the staff in that school if that school is to close. I think that's important both for the board to be able to understand the impact locally, but it's also a great tool for the local community and the district and the board locally to have a conversation about ultimately what is the impact if we make this decision. Another item is further clarifying the capital and equipment at the school for the ISD's use. And that was another lesson learned here in the first year. When I was engaging with the 21 superintendents across the state, when we had the list of 48 schools last fall, as you can imagine, as everybody's learning, I had a couple superintendents and one who explicitly told me, said, look, if you pick my school, I'm pulling every cable out of this building, I'm removing every computer, you will have nothing but the bare walls of this school to come in and get started. Well, not only is that not good for kids, in my opinion, it's not good business, because at the end of 5 years, that school is going right back under the local district. So to remove a network and to do all of that, they have to go back in and put something in, both from a state standpoint in order to even make the school functional, and then on the back end to have that district put all that back in place. It's not very efficient, it's not good business, and ultimately to me it's not good for kids. So putting some clarification in place about those components of equipment and IT and the network so that we can make sure that that is a resource that continues to be in place for the students in that school, for that community, and to continue to do the services that will be there even after the 5 years when the ISD transitions out. 2 more points. Clarifying the ISD superintendent's role in the selection of the school principal. Making sure that the ISD superintendent is involved with input on the selection of the principal and also on the final selection of the school principal. That came up again in conversations, as I recall, and so try to bring those conversations forward to the General Assembly. And I think based on the bill that we saw yesterday and the information in there, the good news is I think many of these things have been heard. And then the final provision is one that came from several stakeholders. And I'll reflect on a comment that was made I think it was just in our last planning meeting with the board. Dr. Gary Henry was in here talking about some of the research and findings. And while Dr. Henry has done great work in North Carolina, he's also known for his work in Tennessee with Vanderbilt on the Achievement School District and on the I-zones. Well, one of the things that he said was that states that are implementing strategies where there's state-level engagement and also things like the I-zones are seeing accelerated growth and achievement for students. So with that, I've said from the very beginning, based on that research, that one of the parts of our legislation that I'm most excited about is the I-zone strategy. And I know that Robeson County Public Schools, they want to implement an I-zone. But there was a caveat in the legislation that could have created a barrier for a district to want to really consider that as an option. And that was in the statute, it said that if a district adopts an I-zone and they don't have the schools in the I-zone exceeding growth in years 4 and in years 5 of the 5-year engagement as a zone, it says they shall become ISD schools. So we can talk about caps all day long of 5, but if we had I-zones, we could potentially risk far exceeding that at the end of 5 years, the way that the language is currently written in the I-zone portion of our legislation. So went back in and asked that that be changed from a shall to a may so that we can continue to exercise good judgment, work hand in hand with our partners in the local districts, and make good decisions on behalf of schools and on behalf of students. And so those are the provisions that were brought forward. They were approved yesterday in the House K-12 committee. And hopefully my explanation of those points provides a little bit of clarity, but I will turn it back over for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. Questions from my colleagues? Yes, Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. A couple of questions. What will be the full size, staff-wise, of the school once everyone is hired?
24 staff.
24, and that includes, that's the whole shebang, teachers, assistants?
Is teachers, assistants, school counselor, instructional coach, office manager, principal, 12 classroom teachers, 2 EC teachers, and 3 specials teachers.
Have you hired anyone yet?
We do have some that we have hired. There are offer letters that have been submitted, and we've gotten some of those back, and so we are full swing. And hopefully by tomorrow we'll have some more updates from our personnel that are at the school now that want to continue with us into next year.
My other question has to do with the return of the school to the public schools of Robeson County in this case. Does the law have any specificity about the process of that return?
It does not. It does talk about some conditions for return, things like early return or what happens at 5 years, and then options to extend that by an additional 3 years if certain benchmarks are hit. Mm-hmm. But on that end, it's going to be something we're going to have to come back and develop some policy. And I would anticipate that the best part of planning for a transition is you plan on the front end, and we've been trying to do that as best we can with the local school system as we're working through the MOU and thinking about how do we keep most things in place, like child nutrition, for example. They've got a good staff in there, the meals are being provided. How do we keep all that in place? The district continues that piece. Custodial staff, some of which live only a few blocks from the school. The campus is clean. It's a facility that's older, but they have pride and they take care of that campus. So that's going to be a service the district retains. And those are just other items that we don't have to worry about transition on the back end.
And then finally, the question is about any kind of year-end reporting back to the public schools of Robeson County. Is that optional, or is it in the law that there shall be or maybe a report back to the local Board of Education?
So there is nothing necessarily specifically in law that specifies any kind of report back, but I have also explained to the local board that I would like to do at least, if not an annual report to the local board, quarterly reports that can also be given by the local principal so that we can keep everybody updated and informed.
Especially as we march toward year 5.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Ms. Willoughby.
Just a couple of questions about the new legislation. I know I believe I heard you say this, but I want to be clear. The provision that allows basically the doubling the number of schools, the one that you said you may recommend, it's not a requirement that you recommend.
On the additional two schools per, may up to 2 schools per year.
That just seems unusual since we haven't really started the pilot yet. We're sort of in the, baby steps toward getting that pilot going. It just seems unusual to already be looking at expansion before we look at the pilot to know. And you did say may, not have to recommend, and so I just want to be clear on that.
Yes, ma'am. It's a may up to 2 additional schools. And again, there's some explicit language in there that ultimately, I would tell you, holds the ISD more accountable than any other school in this state for the outcomes that we have to achieve in the first 3 years.
Right. Well, it's new, and given some of the conversations you and I've had about Tennessee, it's appropriate, I think, to hold it.
Oh, completely
tighter.
agree. But I would also say that while it's new, some of the outcomes in these existing schools are not new, and we owe it to the students there to move forward aggressively. And I think that's what this is really about.
Right. My second question, I don't believe I heard you address this, and maybe it's not maybe I'm looking at an old version of SB 15, but the Part 2 provision that allows spouse employment.
That is not an ISD portion. Apparently, there's 2 elements that were in Senate Bill 15, and one portion is something that I'm going off of my perception, so I do not want to speak to it because I'm not the expert on that bill, but it's a component dealing with something completely outside the ISD. It's something that I believe impacts western region of the state a little bit more, where there's been some situations that have led to superintendent transitions because of some stipulations in law, but that is completely outside of ISD.
That has nothing to do
No,
with
ma'am.
ISD, it just happens to appear in that same piece of legislation.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
I think that last one applies to all 116 districts.
It does. I think the example that was given yesterday, that was an example of something in the western part of the state, which I think precipitated some of the conversation.
Chairman Goby.
Yes, Dr. Hall, we've had some discussions about the administration of the human resources and finances. Can you give us any status report there? Because I know that was very challenging.
It has been, and thank you for asking. Challenging, definitely. This is, school turnaround work is hard work anyways, and I think people recognize that, and my hat's off to districts that lead that work on a day-in and day-out basis and are doing good things. But in this case, when you talk about the administrative portion of this work, I stand before you today as the ISD. I am the only permanent employee of the ISD. I'm fortunate to be able to utilize services from Temp Solutions to help us in navigating this work, but we are going to have to, think critically about that, about how do we move forward with a recurring allocation that's $400,000 to operate the district, which includes everything from me to travel to even work like SchoolWorks, which, doing that kind of evaluation, all the different things that have gone into really getting this up and running. While we were fortunate in this first year to have some funds that were non-reverted to help us with startup costs in year 1, those funds would not be there come July 1st. So we are trying to look at other options and things that we can do to identify resources and obviously be as lean as possible in doing all that goes into supporting one school and ensuring accountability for outcomes in that school and what we have to do to get ready for the selection of the next 2 schools. But we are going to probably engage a third-party group that we will contract to handle our financial reporting and payroll systems in this first year, which I will have to use out of my existing funds, and was very fortunate and blessed to, again, find some team members through Temp Solutions, one of which is part-time, who is a former HR director in Cumberland County Schools, who is helping us navigate the HR components of what we're doing. But even with Temp Solutions, that is a max of 11 months of engagement, and there are some stipulations there that we will have to follow.
So that means that be asking for some additional appropriation in the long session.
Yes, sir.
Right, okay. But you're able to make it to the next session.
I've got 260 students that are making sure and depending on me to make it, so we will have to.
Okay.
We'll add that to the list.
Yeah, yeah.
Mr. McDevitt.
Thank you. You did answer most of my questions in anticipation of that. And some that I didn't have a clue why they were doing some of these things, and I appreciate you sharing with us. I do wonder why we removed the cap so early, but I do hear what you're saying. I think you just answered one of these questions. You said you asked for additional funding. I'm not sure whether I heard you say you got it or did not get that additional funding. You did not.
No, sir.
And so some of this has to do with capacity. You were talking about having to negotiate E-rate and all of those things. Is that going to have to be building by building? Or is that you are now a district that is in anticipation of more schools? Is there an economy of scale eventually here that has to do with capacity relative to some of those functions? I heard you say just now you're getting ready to perhaps negotiate contracts to handle some of these.
Yes, sir. So, for example, on the E-rate, and I continue to sing the praises of all of those behind me and on every floor of this building, because we would not be where we're at in this process without that capacity and that talent. Internal leaders have helped us navigate everything from what we have to do with the financial management to be able to get through this first year in doing those pieces, as well as what we've been doing with the technology division here in the department with E-rate. But I would anticipate that's going to be a building by building level discussion, but also building in some of the safeguards with the equipment and the IT and things like that within the statute. Helps to define it a little bit more so that we can work through those pieces. But we've learned a lot, and I think that will help us in replication as we go forward. But there will be some scales of economy over time. Even with 5 schools, I know it's a small district, but we won't be the smallest district in the state. And you could also argue by geographic would be the largest. So,
well, one of those might be the legislation that just allowed you to be an operator. Could be at least some economy of scale in that sense, or at least one savings. Let me ask you this, if you know, I've seen different reports from different places. How much money have we spent so far, do you know?
This year?
I don't want to, sometimes we get into appropriations and encumbrance, and we've encumbered the money, and I want to know how much we spent.
So I can definitely get you a year-to-date total, but we've had some significant expenses in this first year. One is the evaluation design that we've contracted the Friday Institute.
Right.
So the contract with them was approximately $103,000 for them to do the evaluation design, which is required in legislation and has its own appropriation, but that appropriation is $500,000, and I used the $103 this year as part of our existing fund so that we can keep the full $500 in place for a full evaluation for the next 5 years.
So that doesn't revert?
The $500 does not revert.
Okay.
So that's something that's, the valuation funding of $500,000 is there until the evaluation's complete.
Okay.
But I used the $103 out of existing resources that rolled forward this past year so that I could sustain and keep that $500, whole.
Yeah.
We had a requirement for a website. That's in the statute that we have to have a website that's maintained and managed by the ISD. So that was a cost. We engaged a third party. We've used competitive bid for any expense that we've used. Schoolworks, for example, put out a RFP for that service as well. And Schoolworks is the group that you may recall came and did the presentation on the evaluations of the 2 operators. And they're also working with us to redefine process for next year. So their role is not just evaluation, it's helping us to design what does the application process look like, the rubric going forward for process for selecting operators, and doing strategic planning work with us as well. So everything that we've done this year is definitely within the scope of the budget, and we will probably fall well under budget.
Critical, I just, we're at $600,000 or $700,000. Am I in the ballpark?
It's probably somewhere in that ballpark, yes, sir.
Yeah, and I'm just,
And a lot of that is through Temp Solutions this first year,
Yeah.
trying to engage the temporary support that we needed, website, external relations and communications work.
none of that has to be done. Again, that's economy of scale. Am I right?
A lot of this first year is definitely building the capacity so we know what to do going forward.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, Mr. Griffin.
I just want to clarify something, Dr. Hall. With Senate Bill 15, just kind of looking ahead at the future innovative schools, a few minutes ago, we saw 2 schools that submitted applications to restart. So with the changes with Senate Bill 15, so those schools that deem themselves, say, as restart, they could actually be considered for the innovative school district. Is that correct?
So they could, but here's what I would anticipate for process, and I'm sure that the board would, hold me accountable to this. And part of this is making sure that we have a strong collaboration with our Educator Support Services Division in the agency, is that anybody that we would bring forward, they may qualify, but we're going to look at the lowest performance. We're going to say, okay, of those that are at the bottom of that list of qualifying, do they have a restart? Do they not have a restart? Are they doing a locally implemented, strategy that is helping to improve outcomes? It gives us the opportunity to be better informed about what's really happening. And I'll say this too, I'm a fan of the restarts. I've engaged with a lot of groups out there that are working in that space, and I want to cheer them on and see great things happen. I think it's an opportunity to create more innovation and opportunities in our schools. But I also, having been around school turnaround work and things a long time, there's definitely a significant difference between having a plan and having implementation and effectiveness of that plan. And I think this is making sure that we look at those things over time and make sure that the districts are really delivering on the commitments they've made to the students and the staff in that school to do the things that they've talked about doing to turn the schools around.
Any further questions?
Good job.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Hall, so much for the update.
He had a lot of hair when he started this.
Exactly. Mr. Alcorn, I believe you had a question.
I don't know if it comes up, but I saw where there was a vote on the virtual charter schools in the committee, oversight committee. Does that come before us? Did I miss it, or is it going to come before us through your committee in the future?
I am not sure.
Unfair question for you.
Well, no, not unfair, valid. And so let's see if we can get some clarification. Did anybody hear this question? Mr.
Yeah, the
Alcorn,
virtual.
why don't you restate?
Are we to vote on the North Carolina, the extension, the 4-year extension of the virtual
No.
charter schools?
That was in the budget bill. As I understand, it lacked a little specificity. So as far as the specificity, we are going to have to run that through the Charter School Advisory Board, which will come to us. So we will have a role.
There are several elements, but the critical one extends the time to 2023.
Right.
And so for the ones that are now in existence, I guess it does that for them, but there's no provision for another one, that's for sure.
Well, someone can apply outside the pilot to open up another
So
virtual charter school.
the original legislation called for 2 pilots.
Right.
And is there statutory, do we have the provision to allow us to do a regular school?
I don't think we're prohibited from it. Maybe, I note that we have 2 of our representatives in the crowd. I won't put you on the spot, but we're always glad to see you come around, come over here. Representative John Fraley and Representative Hugh Blackwell, who are very much involved in education over at the General Assembly and appropriations. So if y'all would stand and be recognized, so maybe we can ask those questions of Cecilia tomorrow,
Yeah.
too.
Just one last comment. I'm reminded of the children's book about Big Bear and Little Bear. It's David Bedford, and my boys loved those books because it was all about sounds and experiences. And the one about the Big Bear taking the little bear through the polar snow, the little bear says, "Plod, plod, plod." I think it's a plotter. And Dr. Hall, that's the role that you've assumed. You're plodding forward on behalf of, you're charting new waters, and we applaud you for the efforts that you're making in order to make this school a reality. And we hope that it will be a success and can be replicated, and that we will have 5 schools or even more. Because ultimately it's about making sure that students are successful. Thank you, Dr. Barber and Mr. Machado, for the background information that you provided today. And Mr. Chair, that concludes our session.
Thank you, Ms. White, and I want to echo what you said about Ms. Taylor and her chairing the committee for a little over 5 years. And it's amazing how between the General Assembly's work, the Charter School Advisory Board, the Office of Charter Schools, and this board, that we've, I think, gotten to a very good place as it relates to charter schools. So a big thank you to you for your leadership on that committee. Now, in the absence of the Lieutenant Governor, Ms. Taylor, I'll turn to you as the Vice Chair for the Special Committee on Digital Learning.
Thank you, Chairman Kobe. I am Becky Taylor, and as Vice Chair, I'll be presenting this for our Lieutenant Governor, who is away today for circumstances that he could not control. And I am really excited to introduce our guest. I'm going to actually introduce one of our DPI staff first. As you know, DPI and the Friday Institute, they're charged with implementing the digital learning initiative, and so we have our quarterly presentations. And so Ms. Verna Labahari will introduce our guest and tee this up.
Thank you so much, Ms. Taylor. Good afternoon again, Chairman Kobe, Superintendent Johnson, members of our State Board of Education. Again, I'm Verna Lalbihari, and I direct the Digital Teaching and Learning Division. And as Ms. Taylor mentioned, I co-lead the Digital Learning Initiative with Dr. Jenny Korn from the Friday Institute. We're really pleased to bring before you today our quarterly update. We typically try and bring these to you every 4 times a year, so you need to hold us to that. If you recall, we've organized the Digital Learning Initiative into about 5 or 6 different work streams that align to general statute. These include providing rigorous professional development, ensuring that we have a digital content strategy, looking at our home base roadmap, partnering with our educator preparation programs, our digital learning initiative grants, and the continuous improvement, or what we've been calling our systemic data approach. So as we bring these updates to you, we will select work streams, 1 or more of these work streams, to highlight for you. You heard a little bit about our DLI grant efforts this morning. I'm going to give you a little teaser to our fall update, because in the fall we're actually going to bring a few grant recipients to you so that you can hear directly from our grant recipients on how these grants are impacting their local efforts and the importance of them. So, but our work stream that we're focusing on today is the systemic data approach. And as an initiative, we have committed to making sure that we collect and analyze really critical data points. We're in the weeds, or in the throes right now, of a major data gathering effort. We have an annual effort where we collect digital learning media inventory data, as well as our digital learning progress rubric data. Both of these tools yield data that really not only support current efforts, but inform our future work. They also inform the digital learning dashboard that you're going to hear a little bit more about later on. So without further ado, I'm actually going to turn things over to Dr. Jenny Korn, who's going to talk to you about the digital learning progress rubric and the dashboard. And then Dr. Korn will introduce Dr. Bowden, who will talk to you a little bit more about our very new economic evaluation study. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you guys today. We, as you all know, we've been moving this work forward, really deep collaboration with the department, with members of the legislature that are here today, really helping to guide and inform the work that we've been doing on this. So we really appreciate an opportunity to kind of get some questions from y'all, dig in, check in, and see how things are going with this particular piece. In your board materials, we've included some links. One is a link directly to the DLI rubric, which I'm going to be talking about first, and then an opportunity to explore our brand new digital learning dashboard for policymakers. And then Brooks, Dr. Bowden is going to shift into talking about our economic evaluation. It's a brand new piece of work. I've mentioned it a little bit, but this is really the first time we're getting a chance to speak with you all about kind of concrete next steps, timeline, you know, what the plan is based on feedback we've gotten from stakeholders in the field. So, as you all know, the data from our digital learning progress rubric has been an integral part of strategic planning and advocacy at state and local levels. Based on this, we have decided this year to convene a rubric committee, which will really give us an opportunity to get input from representatives in the field, including one from each state board region, 2 charter school reps, and statewide school, library, and instructional technology associations to make sure that we are both meeting the needs of the field and that the policymakers have the information that they need to provide a clear picture of digital progress and existing needs to support digital age learning. This work is some of the work that I'm most proud of. The rubric that we have developed as a state and that has been adopted at the state, at the district, and at the school level is being replicated all over the country. I can't tell you guys how often we get calls and requests to use this rubric and adopt it by other states. And it's really because it's been such an iterative process that has involved so many people at so many different levels. So one of our next steps with that, we collected it as part of the digital learning plan. In 2015, we had a 100% response rate. This board requested that all districts complete it. We had a 100% response rate from the districts. We had 120 of our 147 charter schools by working in partnership with the Office of Charter Schools. So the last time I was here, we talked about asking districts and charters to complete the rubric again. When I checked right before the presentation, we'd only had 24 districts complete it at this point, and so we've decided to extend we initially had a June 30th deadline, so we're pushing it out to August 15th. So that's just as a way to get and provide opportunities for more districts to complete it. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, may I stop you right there? That's very concerning that we only have a handful when we had 100% participation in 2015. How is it communicated to the field about completing this?
So we, working in partnership with Dr. Labahari's team, we pushed out emails and reminders to the technology directors at the district level. We've worked with the superintendents. We, really trying to push this out. This is a super busy time for our schools and districts, of course. They're trying to wrap up the year. So that's why we thought by extending the deadline, that might give them a little bit more opportunity.
So, go ahead, Chairman Kobe.
Yes. In 2015, the board made this a requirement. How can you underscore that again? It stays as a board requirement. That we get 100% feedback. Who needs to communicate that?
We do.
We do.
I mean, how do we do that?
I would say we do it the same way we did it last
Yeah,
year. 2015. Because,
that stays in place. It hasn't changed.
Right.
So communicate that is board policy.
Yeah. And if you need the extended date, if you like, we'll need, that's okay.
Okay.
But I agree. This is very helpful information for all of us. And our policymakers definitely want to see this. And they don't want to see information from just 24. They need to see it all. So, yeah, I would just send the message out. Remind them it is required, so we need this.
Yes, absolutely. No? Okay. Thank y'all so much for that support. Let's see the next one. So moving on, the next topic we really wanted to talk about was the release of our digital learning dashboard for policymakers. So as part of the digital learning plan, one of the kind of core recommendations was really trying to be transparent about the progress we were making with digital learning. And so a creation of a dashboard was one of the core recommendations that emerged from the digital learning plan. The Friday Institute, in partnership with the department, has really been working over the past couple years to create different iterations of dashboards, really working with our Superintendents Association, our principals, our tech directors to figure out what's that right balance, because there is so much data. Really trying to think about how we can communicate with our stakeholders and with decision makers in kind of a relatively quick way. And we really wanted it to serve as a public, interactive, web-based tool used for analyzing and displaying data about local and statewide digital learning efforts. And so what we really tried to emphasize with this policymaker one, and again, this was just released, I think the board got some information about it a couple weeks ago, it's just been pushed out to members of the legislature, is really designed to emphasize simple navigation, summary of progress, and putting the data in context. So some of the kind of core pieces of this, and it's unbelievable how much work it takes to get it to a simple navigation, you know, really thinking, we have the luxury sometimes at the Friday Institute in partnership with our friends here at DPI and thinking about what are the most critical data pieces that need to be shared so folks at your level that are making decisions about policy and funding can have actionable data. And so where we landed with this version of the dashboard is we really tried to emphasize that every single page is focused on an overarching funding priority at the top of the page. So listed on here, you'll see device trends, personal devices, information about content, school internet, personnel for digital learning, professional development, and funding. And then as we were digging in and trying to figure out what is a really good way that allows you to interpret the data, it allows the viewer to select up to 3 districts. There's a short description that kind of talks about what is our overall goal to provide a summary of progress. And then for each image, we also wanted to include orange and blue reference points that put the data in context for interpretation. So it's always amazing to me how, you know, months and months and months of work come out in, you know, 5 or 6 pages, but we've really done a lot. And there's also an opportunity, I think we've got a space on there for feedback if you have questions or want additional information about how to use and, you know, how to use or clarifications on some of the data points. But we've really we're really proud of this work. We think it really does a good job of telling the story of digital learning in a pretty comprehensible and user-friendly way. And then before I kind of introduce my colleague, Ms. Taylor, is there any other questions that anybody has about dashboards or?
Sounds good. Keep going.
Okay, great. So I'm very excited about this. So moving on to an update about our efforts to plan an economic evaluation study. As you all know, members of this board, as well as legislators, frequently ask us, how do we know what we are doing is working, and what is our return on our commitment to resources and investment in digital learning? In response, we have partnered with a new faculty at NC State College of Education to develop a study plan this year. Dr. Bowden is an assistant professor of methods and policy in the Department of Educational Leadership, Policy, and Human Development. She earned her PhD at Columbia in 2014 and worked with Dr. Henry Levin at the Center for Benefit Cost Studies of Education at Columbia before moving to Raleigh in 2016. We're so thrilled to have someone with her methodological background and experience in conducting an economic evaluation study as one of our partners. So she's going to tell you a little bit about what we've put together so far and answer any questions you might have about next steps.
Thank you, Dr. Corn, for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be here today and to be able to partner with you all and DPI on this important work for North Carolina. Thank you, Superintendent Johnson and Chairman Kobe, and members of the board for your time and attention today. I also want to be sure to thank Governor Forrest for his support of this work. I'm thrilled to be able to contribute relevant and useful evidence toward your goals of seeing all of North Carolina's students graduate ready for post-secondary education and work, and prepared to be globally engaged and productive citizens. So economic evaluation. This is a broad term. It encompasses a set of methods and metrics which allow us to examine the efficiency of policies and programs. This type of research is important because it helps us to ensure that we are using our resources to best serve the children of North Carolina. I like to call this term an umbrella term because it includes the examination of impacts and costs, which can then be used in a cost effectiveness analysis or a benefit cost analysis. All of these approaches build upon what we call the ingredients method, and this method requires that costs are estimated as carefully and rigorously as impacts. The basic principle underlying the method is that all resources have a value and must be considered in an economic evaluation to understand how outcomes were changed and to replicate impactful approaches successfully. In this study, we are using the term economic evaluation rather than return on investment to reflect the rigor of this work. This term allows us to employ any of these methods, along with some other approaches, to ensure that this research is as useful as possible for policymakers. So also to achieve our goal of policy relevance, the first step in planning this work was to talk with stakeholders, such as legislators, district superintendents, CFOs, technology directors, and members of this board, including Mr. Alcorn. In these conversations, Dr. Corn and I asked for input on what a study like this means to them. We wanted to ensure that this work was useful at the end of the day. From these meetings, we learned that a top priority was knowing if the state's investments in digital learning were working. So in other words, was this producing a return or was this moving the needle for our students? So the economic evaluation of the North Carolina Digital Learning Initiative is guided by the goal to learn about past investments and allocation of resources to inform the initiative going forward. This is a major innovation, and this work is intended to help understand where we've been and where we might go in the future. Our analyses will examine trends in digital learning, such as resource allocation from the state, district, and others, access and reception to technology, digital resources, and internet. The research will examine outcomes at all levels of education, students through their achievement, behavior, and attainment, teachers in classrooms with teacher investments, classroom instructional approaches, and supplemental support, school-based systems of support, and education outside the classroom through learning and engagement with students, their families, and communities. So to accomplish this, the evaluation will include two main components, and that's what you'll see a little bit there on your slide. The first component is a statewide landscape analysis that will examine the Digital Learning Initiative, resource allocation, and outcomes using data from DPI and other sources such as the U.S. Census and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and other agencies. I would especially like to thank Ms. Lal Bahari, Mr. Pond, Mr. Tomberlin, and the team at DPI for their effort and collaboration in compiling the data that we need to do this work. The second component will complement this work by focusing on a few select districts that have made significant progress in implementing digital learning strategies. We also wanted this portion of the study to reflect different approaches, differing areas of the state that are serving differing levels of the population. We're really excited to be able to share today that the 5 districts who are interested in partnering with us are Greene County Schools, Morrisville Graded School District, New Hanover County Schools, Rutherford County Schools, and Rowan Salisbury Schools. In each case, we plan to obtain details about how a major initiative like this is operationalized and delivered to students by gaining an understanding of each district's goals and the resources leveraged. This work will include district level, school level, and family level data to build a rich picture of how the plan was carried out. In addition, we're talking with other districts too to see about ways that we might expand these partnerships. And I should also mention too that the Golden Leaf Foundation has been a significant supporter of state and local district and local digital learning efforts. Mr. Gerlach and Mr. Searles have been incredibly helpful in this planning phase thus far. Okay, a little bit for our timeline. Our plan is to keep building these relationships with districts and beginning to clean and analyze the state data this summer. We'll visit the districts and schools and hopefully get the chance to talk with some parents and community members during the fall. We look forward to sharing preliminary findings from all of this work with you all in the winter. So thank you again for your time today, and we look forward to your thoughts and questions and being in touch as this work progresses.
I have a question. When we communicate back out to the field that this is a requirement and we need it, hearing that you're gonna be working on this summer, do we need to stretch the deadline out that far? You're gonna need that data soon.
I think the deadline is fine.
Is it? Okay.
Because we're gonna, with the rubric data is everybody in the state, and that will be one of the data points that Brooks and her team look at as we move forward on the economic evaluation. So I think the August 15th should be okay. Thank you, though.
Thank you. We're really excited about your work.
Thank
I'm glad
you.
you're here today, Brooks.
Thank you so much.
Any questions or comments? Mr. Alcorn?
Great stuff, Dr. Bowden and Warren. What does it look like on the family contact process? You said go and talk to families in your 5-minute and 38-second presentation.
I told you.
What is that face to face? What? How's that? Is there a model for that already?
Well, we're going to work through it. So in my work previously, a lot of the work, some of the questions can require some rapport building, because I ask people questions about things like how many hours do you dedicate to a certain task, and how large is that room that you work in. These are not super fun questions to ask. They're not the most engaging. So a lot of times the data that I collect are best collected through conversation. However, that's not the most efficient way of collecting data either. So a lot of my work in the methodological side of things has been devoted to simplifying the ways that we collect and process the data that we need to do this kind of work. So there'll be a little bit of both, like maybe as much as possible any kind of like surveys or targeted interviews, utilizing a lot of the data that we have already. I just have to applaud you all just generally as a state for the levels and amounts of data that you guys collect, so that we can come in and do this without overburdening those individuals who are in the schools and those families out in the community.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Good.
Yeah, great presentation. Ms. Labahari, Dr. Korn, Dr. Bowden, thank you so much for being here today. And that concludes our report, Chairman Covey.
Okay, well, thank you, Ms. Taylor. We'll now move on to the Educator Standards and Practices Committee. I recognize Dr. Olivia Oxendine.
Thank you, Chairman Covey. I am Olivia Oxendine, and co-chairing this committee with me is Miss Amy White. I'm very happy to welcome you to this committee. This is a fun committee. We do big things about licensing, preparing licensing, and making sure teachers stay certified for 30 years or longer. That's the work of the committee. The first item, we have 2 action items, ES&P 1, Career and Technical Education, Licensure Manual Amendments. This item was presented last month. It will be voted on tomorrow. And in your material, you have noted for you, there has been just a minor revision to one section of CTED 004. And pardon me, I'm going to read to you what it says. The CTE manual has been revised due to a technical correction for 74010. Collision repair is the name of the licensure area, and their credential must be earned before the person can begin teaching. So this item will be voted on tomorrow. Is there anything else I need to say about that, Mr. Kirkman? Thank you very much. So we will move on to the next item, which is ES&P 2, a State Board Policy Amendment to LICN 003, the Ed TPA and the PPAT cut scores. This item was also presented last month, and in a nutshell, what you have before you, we have the process for making a decision about the cut scores based on the candidate taking either the Ed TPA or the PPAT. The process is outlined in the executive summary for you. This will go into effect, meaning in 2019, 2020, all teacher education majors in North Carolina must take one of these 2 exams in order to qualify for licensing. So this item will also be presented tomorrow for voting. Anything else I need to say pertaining to that, Dr. Tomberlin? Very good. We will go on to Action on first reading, recommendations from this item, I'll just stop right here because this is a closed session item, will be taken up later this afternoon. The next item, ES&P 4, report to the General Assembly on the North Carolina pilot on teacher compensation and advanced teaching roles. The item was just added to the agenda in the last couple of days. We probably need, this report is due into the General Assembly very, very, very soon. There was an extension given several months ago to continue collecting data, so it's ready for submission to the General Assembly. I would like to have, is someone in the audience prepared to give us a quick summary of that? Dr. Tripp Stallings is coming forward. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, board members. I think I always try to make it a purpose when I come here to make my presentation shorter than the time before. This is as short as I can do it because I don't have a presentation for you. What we've done here is we've helped, we have received information a couple of weeks ago that the legislature needed a report. We got brought onto this project sometime in mid-October, which is actually after the original report was due. So what we did was compiled all the information that I shared with this board a few months ago, along with some additional information about what we think is possible to do in terms of quantitatively evaluating the impact of the pilots. Since we submitted that report, we read in the current version of the budget that there's also an extension of the pilots from 3 years to 8 years. We'll have to talk to you all, to the department, about what that means for the ongoing evaluation. The update, though, is we now have a very good understanding of how each of the 6 pilots operates, and that's no small task, given that in some of the districts, the pilot operates differently at individual schools. That is, in one way, very promising because it means we have a lot of different things to look at in terms of what might be good for the state in terms of advanced teaching roles. It also is incredibly challenging in terms of coming up with any kind of quantitative evaluation for the impacts. We met with a number of quantitative experts who are not part of the project so we could get their independent thoughts about the best approach for doing that. This report summarizes how we plan to approach the quantitative piece of the evaluation, and in a lot of ways it reflects what we're doing in our work on evaluating the impact of Read to Achieve, which is, in very simple terms, we are looking at how the presence of the policy impacts the variables that matter to us. So because Vance's pilot is different from Edgecomb's pilot, is different from Charlotte's pilot, is way different from Chapel Hill's pilot, we can't really say much about how the individual pieces of those pilots are having differential impacts. We're going to try. But we can say whether or not the presence of having advanced teaching roles in general, if having differentiated pay and advanced roles makes a difference. We will continue to try to refine that as well as we can. Some of that will depend on the degree to which the districts change their plans. We will be checking with them. We go out there on a regular basis every semester to find out how their implementation is going. We have been to every district, I think 2 or 3 times at this point this spring alone. We want to thank them for accommodating us, especially so late in the year. In addition to that, I don't know that there's many other updates to give that I didn't give you the last time, other than to let you know that I think one of the greater values of the work that we're doing, and usually we try to find a way to numerically determine the impact of a program, and we'll do that here, like I said, but this is one where we really need to get under the hood and understand how teachers are reacting to the presence and the possibility of these different teaching roles, and not just the teachers who were there. One of the other things we plan to do is to reach out to our colleges of education and to talk to the potential teachers and ask them how these different plans, how they resonate with these different plans, and whether or not these make a difference in the way they're thinking about where they're going to go and teach. So that is the very high-level update. The report itself is not particularly long. There's a number of appendices that I hope will at least illustrate the different approaches each district is taking. Last time I was here, I shared with you an overall logic model that demonstrated the state's perception of how it works. In the appendix, there's a separate image for each of the 6 pilots, which will give you some idea of the differences across the 6 efforts. Though I will note again that in at least 2 of the districts, the implementation is different school to school. So in some ways, there's probably 20 or 30 implementations.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments? How will this be presented to the General Assembly? Just presented, or are you going to do a PowerPoint presentation or?
That is up to them. So we are ready to go if they'd like for us to come. It would not be the first time. We actually have presented since the first years of Race to the Top every year on strategic staffing and other similar initiatives because there's such interest in it. Especially, I would guess, given the extension of the pilots, that implies there is some additional interest. We're happy to share with them in any way or form that they'd like.
Thank you very much. So tomorrow we will vote to approve the submission of this report to the General Assembly. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
The next item is we're moving on to ES&P 5. This is a discussion item. It pertains to LICN 001. To me, this is kind of the mother of all policies with regard to licensing teachers in North Carolina, or licensing educators in North Carolina. So I will ask Dr. Tomberlin to come forward and do a overview. You're going to be really excited about this PowerPoint because it has a flow chart. It's going to give us a flow chart of how North Carolina does this thing called licensing educators. So put on your seatbelts.
Good afternoon.
Good
Thank
afternoon.
you. I am Tom Tomberlin, Director of School Research Policy and School Research Data and Reporting. And I am here to talk to you today about recommended changes to LICN 001, specifically related to the residency model. As most of you know, with the passage of Senate Bill 599, the lateral entry licensing process is going away as of June 30th, 2019. And so the alternate route, or the non-traditional route, to teacher licensing will be now known as the residency license, or the residency model. And so in advance, while lateral entry has not yet sunsetted, the residency model is in effect for this coming school year. So we felt it necessary to put some parameters around that model, so districts and EPPs that chose to go down this route will know some of the expectations of the State Board of Education for completing this path to licensure. So the residency model is the new pathway to replace lateral entry. The residency license itself is only valid for 1 year, and it must be renewed every year, and it can be renewed up to twice, which allows a 3-year period to move from the residency model to an IPL, or I'm sorry, an ILP, an initially licensed, no, it was an IPL, initial professional license, or a continuing professional license, a CPL. The period can last no longer than 3 years from the initial granting of the license to its conversion or expiration. So the requirements to convert to an IPL or CPL must be completed before the expiration of the second renewal of the residency license. The requirements for this license are that the candidate hold a baccalaureate degree, and the candidate must have 24 hours of content relevant to the course or the licensure areas being sought, or have passed the appropriate State Board of Education content exam. Must be enrolled in an EPP, which is an educator prep program, which is not the same as an Institute of Higher Education. So educator prep programs can be housed within an IHE or an Institute of Higher Education, or they can be a separate organization. And the candidate must complete pre-service training requirements as defined by the State Board of Education. So, what everyone came for, the flow chart. So this flow chart describes the traditional path to an initial license, and also the alternative route for getting into the residency model or being issued a residency license. This is very important for districts because we have a couple of tools available to us that would allow either a direct access to a residency license or indirect, and I'll explain how that works. So if you look at the top, that is the straightforward linear approach to becoming an initially licensed teacher. You're accepted into an IHE, you enroll in an EPP at some point, usually your junior year. You complete the coursework required for that, and you pass your EdTPA or PPAT, and you complete the program and are recommended by your IHE for an initial license, and you can be granted an initial professional license. The alternate route here, and what we're trying to allow for, is folks who hold at least a baccalaureate degree to enter into the teaching profession if they choose. So the second route, in the first column here, the candidate holds a baccalaureate degree and has been employed by an LEA. So the LEA has said, we think that you would make a great teacher. We've got a job for you. Now, how do we get you into the path to teacher licensure? And that requires a couple of that depends on on one particular factor, that the baccalaureate degree, within the baccalaureate degree, the candidate has sufficient number of content hours. If this candidate has 24 or more content hours relevant to the license, then the candidate would enter the residency model through the dark green path at the very top. So they have the 24 hours. That allows them, they continue to work with, they enroll in the EPP, and they can get a residency license. In many cases, though, the candidate will not have 24 hours. Let's take the position that the candidate has, let's say, 12 hours, wants to become a middle school math teacher, and has 12 credit hours in mathematics. That teacher can be granted what we call a permit to teach. That was formerly known as the emergency permit to practice, emergency permit. That is a one-year non-renewable license. Districts often use it when they can't find another teacher, but they have a teacher with a bachelor's degree and they want to be able to pay them on the teacher salary scale. They leverage this license. We're proposing that this license be part of the pathway to gaining a residency license. So if the teacher has fewer than 18 hours in the content area, the LEA could grant that teacher a permit to teach that would last for 1 year. If the teacher gets to 18 hours in the content area, then the teacher can apply for what's called an emergency license, and that's the light green in the middle there. So if the teacher has between 18 and 23 credit hours relevant to the coursework, they could be issued an emergency license. During the course of that 1 year non-renewable emergency license, the teacher would have to gain coursework sufficient to qualify for the residency license, which is 24 hours. And you can see over to the right, the bottom right, in the event that, that a teacher holding a permit to teach does not reach the threshold of 18 hours of relevant coursework, that license would expire. Well, it would expire anyway, but it couldn't roll into an emergency license. If at the end of the emergency license, the teacher doesn't meet the 24 hours required to hold a residency license, the license would expire and the teacher could not continue forward. And that is stage one. That is to get, in both those cases, that is to get the teacher either into an initial professional license or a residency license. So the second stage of this is what happens to the teacher now that they're in this process. So for teachers who have, on the traditional route, they of course have 3 years of an IPL. And in those 3 years, there are certain requirements that must be met in order to move forward to conversion. One of those is at the end of the first year, the teacher must attempt all licensure exams related to the licenses that are being sought. In the second year, the teacher is required to pass those licensure exams before moving to the third and final year of the IPL. If the teacher successfully completes those requirements and participates in all 3 years in a beginning teacher support program, that teacher can convert to a continuing professional license. For the residency route, things are a little different. At the end of the first year, The requirement for any 1 year in a residency model is that the teacher maintain employment with an LEA and a relationship with an EPP. So those two things have to be in place every year. If they're not, the license would expire and the teacher could not pursue a continuing license. The thing that's different about the residency model is it doesn't require the teacher to hold that license for the whole term, the whole 3-year term, like it does for lateral entry. At any point the teacher meets the requirements for converting to a CPL or to a professional license, the teacher can make that move. And that's indicated by the yellow box here. Optional that it is optional in any given year that the teacher could pass the licensure exam and or receive EPP recommendation for full licensure. If that happens, the teacher would move into the appropriate year of the initial professional license and would continue on an initial professional license until he or she completed 3 years and or 3 years of BTSP process. If the teacher does not complete in all the requirements for converting to a continuing professional license at the end of the 3rd year of the residency license, then the license would expire and could not convert to a continuing license. I know that's very complicated, and as I have talked to our groups, the Teacher Recruitment and Retention Task Force and to the Pepsi Commission, in order to provide flexibility, the model must be fairly complex. You cannot have simplicity and flexibility in the same model. So we apologize for that, but we're hoping what we're providing is the opportunity for districts to use creative methods to move teachers through this pipeline to a continuing professional license.
Does anyone have a question? Well, take out a sheet of paper and number from 1 to 10. It's time for the quiz. I have a question. If you'll go back to the first frame of the flow chart.
Yes, ma'am.
If you looking at the alternative route, the emergency license in the light green, see, emergency suggests to me that a school district needs a teacher. Mm-hmm. And I am that teacher, let's pretend for just a minute. So I fulfill a year in the emergency license status. There's no requirement, according to this flow chart, that I can just decide not to come back the 2nd year and go off and do something else.
Absolutely.
So it suggests to me that from emergency license status, there is an automatic next step to the dark green box. Is that?
So at the end of the emergency license, this question is asked, does the candidate have 24 hours? You can see that the green arrow coming off to the right, if the answer is yes, mm-hmm. then that could move to the residency license. If the answer is no, the red arrow leads to the expiration of the license. Mm-hmm. But I appreciate your comment about the emergency license. It seems like what we're calling the permit to teach should be called the emergency license. It used to be called an emergency permit. The difficult we have is legislation defines this license as an emergency license. So we needed to change the other one. We couldn't change the emergency license because really what its primary purpose is to serve as a bridge. The permit to teach is really the one you're talking about. I just need somebody in this classroom, and I may or may not have expectations of continued employment for that person, or the candidate, him or herself, may not have any expectation of continuing. And that seems more, that permit to teach captures that situation better than the emergency license.
So too. Mr. Davis?
Thanks. Tom, have you received any feedback or input from districts on this model?
Copious. Yes, we have put this before our Teacher Recruitment and Retention Task Force. to explain this process of how this would go forward. It's a little more intuitive for them because it does, in many ways, it kind of follows along the lateral entry process with some slight differences. So for those who are kind of hip deep in this work, this is not as confusing as the flow chart suggests, I think. But they seem, most of what we see in here is statutorily required. So there wasn't a whole lot of wiggle room in how we constructed it. We just wanted to make sure that the moving parts, everybody was clear about how one moved between the parts.
Sure. I understand it's statutorily required, but not all. Sometimes there's unintended consequences in statute, and it behooves us to provide feedback to the lawmakers on this. I didn't know if maybe in your work you had heard any feedback from those that have to live with and make this work that would make this better.
I think the biggest piece that we got from the field was the leveraging of the emergency permit to practice. I think most folks view that as kind of a throwaway license, that it's just something you use to get somebody in the door for that 1 year. And what we've tried to do here is to incorporate it into this process. You could still use it in the way that it's always been used, but incorporating it into the process allows us to take people who may not have, it allows us to look at people and determine where they best fit, they come into this model based on their transcripts. So you could have somebody who has absolutely no math, and you could get them in on that permit to teach. That would be a harder route for them. I mean, they'd have to do a lot of work to catch up, but it really does offer a lot of flexibility for folks to get people into the pipeline.
Thank you, Dr. Oxenine.
Any other questions? Mr. Alcorn.
Is there a 5 or 10 year forecast on new teacher entry entering the field as to the percentage of them being traditional versus alternative?
I don't, that's going to be a function of how many, with 599 allowing for a broader definition of EPP, how many of those kind of non-IHE EPPs we see coming into North Carolina to do business. I think we're going, the more of those we get that want to play ball in North Carolina, I think the more common the residency license is going to be in the residency route.
So the residency pathway could become, over time, the traditional approach.
Yes, maybe before we send this out, we not refer to the
old school.
Traditional and alternative. We find better labels for these routes because you're right. I think what we consider, what's traditional today may be different tomorrow.
Okay.
How about standard route?
Sure.
The standard route.
Mm-hmm. We can make those changes, absolutely.
I wonder, Tom, how the number or the percentage of teachers in classrooms who are in that emergency or permit to teach status.
So as far as we know, there's no one in that in these paths right now because the residency model doesn't become viable until the 17-18 school year. Wait, no. This is 18-19 school year. So we're anticipating some people starting to get into this in the school year. We
have no situations where school systems are in a crunch for teachers and they have to.
Oh, you mean currently just using the emergency permit?
Right.
I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. That would we could certainly.
I would be interested in knowing, because that would give us a feel of where we stand in terms of the pipeline.
Sure. Well, just to be clear, the emergency permit currently is not being used as an avenue is not an on-ramp to the pipeline. Maybe that's maybe. It is an effort to fill an emergency situation.
A situation.
Yeah, and we want to change that. so that it can be used, it can be a functional. I mean, we don't want to take that opportunity away from districts, as we recognize that that may be the only option they have, but we also want to open this up as a possible on-ramp to teacher licensure.
More continuous.
Yes.
Okay.
One quick question.
Ms. Taylor has a question.
One quick question for clarification, and I may have missed this. So how does this play into lateral entry? Is that what this is, or that's a whole different ballgame?
Well, as you can see, there are some elements of this that are similar.
Yeah.
Lateral entry as a formal process will go away. The last lateral entry license that can be issued is June 30th, 2019.
Okay.
So that process is shutting down.
Yep.
We will have to continue to support those licenses through 2022, but this is the new model moving forward. If you're not in an IHE-based EPP program.
So then, I don't know if you know the answer to this one. What's the percent of teachers we have that are lateral entry teachers in North Carolina? Do you know? I think we have a lot.
We do have a lot.
Yes, we do have a lot, but I'm assuming you would like a more specific number than a lot. Yes.
Yeah.
I will get you those numbers as well.
No hurry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
I don't know, the trend would also be helpful in that.
So is the percentage increasing over time?
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, because it was almost a third 10 years ago.
It is a substantial number of the beginning teacher force, yes. It would also be interesting to know how they compare with traditionally prepared teachers in terms of their attrition rates. Those 5 years, we often talk about the high teacher attrition in 5 years and whether it's different for lateral entry as opposed to traditionally prepared. And I can certainly do that from the teacher turnover report.
Given the fact that lateral entry sunsets
2019 is the last license that can be issued.
But
all lateral entry licenses would have to be cleared by June 30th, 2022.
exactly. So timing is critical.
Yes.
Someone else has a question, Elisa?
Just for clarification, in the traditional mode, once they complete their program, they get their initial license, and then you said they have a 3-year period of time where they have to pass necessary tests, more tests.
So are we talking about traditional route?
Yes.
So it would be a 2-year window.
All right, 2 years. Right.
Attempt in the first,
Sorry.
pass in the second. That's okay.
Right. So, but the alternative route, do they have to take those tests?
That is not prescribed in law. And that is certainly an issue that the board can address.
Okay.
I
I wanted to make sure that was out there and y'all were clear that traditional route teachers have to go through many more hoops than the alternative route, thus making the pipeline a little skewed. So I just want to make sure y'all were aware of that.
So that is correct. The requirement, there was no yearly requirement for testing for a residency license holder. The expectation is that the license could be renewed up to twice to meet any outstanding requirements. And so we did not impose pass in the first year, attempt in the first year, pass in the second on the residency model. That is, however, it is not precluded, you are not precluded from imposing that requirement on those residency license holders as the State Board of Education. If the goal is parity in the processes, then that's certainly an option we could take.
So what do we have in the yellow boxes?
So-
I'm not looking on my own screen, I'm looking up there.
That's okay.
But
So-
isn't there some mention on the alternative route pathway, some mention about testing or passing something?
Yes, and it says optional. So at the end of the first year, so a teacher in the first year of residency could attempt and pass the licensure exam, and let's say that is the only requirement. Their preparation was such that the EPP is ready to recommend them at the end of their first year, and they pass the licensure exam. That candidate could then transfer the residency license into an IPL, an initial professional license. So that teacher would go from first year residence license to a second year IPL. And that just puts them up in what we call the traditional route it shifts them out of the residency model into the IPL. Now with lateral entry, we didn't have that opportunity to shift. You were lateral entry for 3 years, and at the end of the 3 years, if you met all the requirements, you converted to a CPL. Both paths ended the same way. In this situation, the residency, if the teacher doesn't have 3 years, but completes all the requirements of the residency model, they would have to shift into an IPL because they don't have sufficient number of years of experience to hold a CPL.
But after my first year in residency status and I take an exam, let's say the EPP approves me and for IPL status, all that happens. So that I go into the second year status as an IPL, not the first year status. So the first year as in the residency status, if
Right.
all goes well and the EPP says, check off, Olivia, you're ready to go in the classroom to teach. That year in the residency, that 1 year in the residency status replaces the first year as an IPL.
That is correct.
Yay.
And in both cases, the teacher would be participating in a beginning teacher support program. So really that's the underlying requirement for both paths, is that you have 3 years of teaching experience and have participated in a BTSP. So whichever route you get there is all leading to a CPL. And you can jump tracks. You can jump the track from a resident to an IPL should you meet the requirements.
Mr. Chairman
Yes.
Covey.
I know this elicits a lot of questions, but I'm watching the clock.
Okay, I get
and
you.
we need to move on.
We need to move on. Thank you so much for you have a couple more frames.
Oh, yes, that's what I was looking at.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
I will be.
see how expeditiously you can go through these.
Sorry, I'm so deep into this flow
Yeah.
chart.
I gathered.
So some of the additional provisions of this license are that military personnel and their spouses called to active duty can stop the program and restart upon return where they left off. So the clock would stop, as it were. CTE has the opportunity to establish alternative criteria for this in lieu of a bachelor degree. And then finally, residency licenses are issued at the A level. There are no master level residency licenses. And that concludes the residency model. But within LICN 001 was also an adjustment to some language regarding school counselors. That language was communicated to us by our consultants that the language was somewhat outdated, and it was the changes were in line with language that had already been approved in eval 026. So nothing substantive there, just alerting you to the fact that we did change some language there. Again, this change, as I referenced earlier, the emergency permit to teach has been renamed permit to teach to reduce confusion with the legislatively created emergency license. And that concludes the changes to LICN 001.
Thank you very much. Great presentation.
Absolutely. Next, we have TCED 004, the Licensure Area Program Approval Process. Dr. Syberg has spoken with the board previously about the process that we engage in at approving programs at the licensure area level, and our desire to move to take that approval process up a notch at the program level. So right now we do two levels of approval: the EPP initial authorization, that the institution is reviewed by CAPE reviewers and then brought to you for approval, and then we do the more granular licensure area approval, and this is what brings you those hundreds of approvals that you get from Dr. Syberg a lot of times where we quickly go through them and approve them. And our recommendation is that we bring this up to the organization level, that we're approving EPPs as an organization, not the individual licensure areas. So the current processes we're doing, it's not a meaningful gatekeeper. It becomes very rote, and you quickly want to move through them just as much as we quickly want to move through them. and it's not sustainable. They're not getting really in-depth feedback on these licensure areas, individual licensure areas. Additionally, to do this review requires an extensive volunteer peer network that's really difficult to maintain. The recommended changes is that we bring this up to the institution level, and we focus less on what the EPPs are writing in their proposal and more on the outcomes that they're producing from the EPP. So we will, of course, review their assurances. The EPPs will provide us with assurances that they're doing what we've asked them and what we expect them to do as ed prep providers. And they will document that in a formal process. But we may ask for some changes, but we're not going to dig deeply into that. What we are going to dig deeply into is the outcome measures for these EPPs. And these are the outcome measures that are required by the State Board of Education. This is year 2, and you can see that there's quite a number of benchmarks that these EPPs have to hit. And then finally, 3 years after the authorization, we get the 70% proficiency of their candidates in the field, and the proficiency in growth measures for their candidates, and 70% or greater pass rate on the licensure exam areas. Once we look at these in an EPP that seems to be struggling, the data is more easily disaggregated to see if there are problem areas in the EPP. So if an EPP looks okay overall, we would know that their biology license area is not performing well, and we can alert them to that in advance of any sanctions. Just some other accountability measures that we would employ: the recent graduate survey and an employer survey. And so that is our proposal, is to focus less on the EPP, the process up front, the front end of the process, the inputs into the system, and focus more heavily on the outputs from the system.
Okay, very good. Questions, comments? And we will act on that next month. And we have one final item, ES&P 7, the application for an EPP. Are you going to present that, Dr. Tomberlin?
I am. So Charlotte Mecklenburg, so our new EPP application for initial authorization, we have our first applicant, and that is Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools, requesting to become an EPP in conjunction with the new Teacher Center. I hope I have that right. TNTP, right. The New Teacher Project. And they have submitted an application to us. We sent that application to CAPE reviewers. They reviewed, made some recommendations. We sent it back to CMS with the feedback from the CAPE reviewers, and CMS made those adjustments to the application. And we are bringing that to the board now for approval, because CMS would like to begin their EPP with the 18-19 school year.
What are you requesting, to have this moved? Action on first read?
I think that CMS would be appreciative of that, but we did let them know that it could be till July until they had approval on their application.
My only reservation with action on first read, and it could be something you could resolve on a telephone conversation with CMS, Dr. Tomberlin, in looking at the proposal, the application, in the mathematics section, because I think they want to prepare in the area of math and elementary education. I'm missing the substance about the math curriculum. It doesn't seem to be mathematics. It seems to be something other than mathematics.
So my assumption, and I don't want to speak for Charlotte Mecklenburg here, but my assumption is that part of their process would be, especially for their math candidates, that they would be screening for candidates who have a strong content knowledge in mathematics. And so the focus of the program is to help those candidates with strong mathematics content knowledge to have a better mathematics pedagogy. Mm-hmm. But it's a great question, and we can certainly reach out to Charlotte Mecklenburg and see how they respond to that question of what appears to be a lack of content in their mathematics
And
curriculum.
you're probably exactly right. They have 4-year degrees perhaps in mathematics. They just need the pedagogical piece. So with your approval, Chairman Kobe, I would like to move that to an action on first read.
Okay, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. That ends my committee report.
Okay, well.
I got an
you ended
idea.
up going through.
See, I had it all planned.
Yeah. Okay. We have one new business.
Oh, I'm sorry. We do have,
Item,
we
yes,
have one
that's
business
right,
item.
yeah.
Oh, no. I'm getting ahead of my skis on this.
Yeah, right.
I'm sorry, Dr.
I was going
Martin.
along with you.
I am very sorry. That means you get 2 hours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to use it. Good afternoon to all state board members and advisors. I am Cynthia Martin. I lead Level 1 services in the Educator Support Services Division. Deployment of the Teacher Working Condition Survey falls under Educator Advancement and Recognition Levels of Support. My colleague, Abe Klein, Senior Analyst for our survey vendor, New Teacher Center, will assist me today. Thank you for the opportunity to share the 2018 North Carolina Teacher Working Conditions Survey results. The survey is a valid and reliable instrument designed to measure educator perceptions about the presence of teaching and learning conditions that research has shown increase student learning and teacher retention. Because of this, it is a highly anticipated data set for schools and districts across the state. Local superintendents received a preview of the data on May 24th, and the data will be available on the TWC website momentarily. I want to start by sharing some of the contextual details surrounding our highest participation rate, 90.55%, in the history of the North Carolina Teacher Working Conditions Survey. The survey is given every other year with its off year used for planning. With input and a lot of support from the state superintendent and deputy state superintendent, we revived the TWC Advisory Committee. That's an 18-member committee representing internal and external stakeholders. The committee reviewed survey composition, processes, and feedback. In doing so, question language was clarified, answer choices were broadened, and questions were examined to make sure they were valuable to school improvement. We will highlight some of the most striking trends in the data and some of the responses to new questions during the data presentation. We also improved some of our communication processes. School improvement chairs were enlisted to serve alongside NCAE reps as school contacts. Our goal was to make sure every school in the state had 1 to 2 representatives to lead this effort in their building. Each region had a regional education facilitator assigned who disseminated information and answered questions. Educator Support Services members called every school that fell below minimal reporting. Every school. I am pleased to report that 109,453 educator voices were included in this year's data. 97.6% of North Carolina schools and 100% of districts met the minimum threshold to generate a data report. This number is comprised of teachers, principals, assistant principals, and other staff members such as media coordinators, academic coaches, school counselors, and itinerant educators in any North Carolina public elementary, middle, high, charter, and special schools. Our special schools consist of schools like the School for the Deaf and Blind, Department of Health and Human Services schools, and juvenile justice schools. There were also 1,679 schools that had 100% participation on the survey. We congratulated all of those schools publicly, and we also partnered with NCBCE and NCAE again to award several schools with cash prizes and incentives. All results can be found at the TWC website ncteachingconditions.org/results. In the upcoming weeks, I have promised to send to superintendents and charter leaders additional reports. Now, I would like to introduce Abe, who will share the data presentation. We don't have a flow chart like Tom Tomberlin, but we did prepare a glossy one-pager that kind of shows you some of the trends in the data.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. She said, my name is Abe Klein. I've been with the New Teacher Center for the last 4 years, so now I've been the analyst behind the scenes for the last 3 iterations of the Teacher Working Conditions Survey. I've invested a lot of time and energy into looking through this data, and I'm excited to be here to talk to you about it. So let's get started. Dr. Martin did kind of steal my thunder on a few of these first points, but I'm going to reiterate them anyways. Because we like to talk about, when we're talking about the Teacher Working Conditions Survey, we always like to level set and say that this is a statistically valid and reliable instrument. And more importantly, we like to talk about the fact that this is not an assessment of teachers' morale for specific policies. And it's mostly our hope that the data will be taken back to the schools and back to the local level to be a starting point for conversations of why teachers' perceptions are what they are and what steps we can take to continue to improve conditions in our schools. So the TWC covers 8 constructs. There are anywhere from 7 to 12 items related within each of these constructs, and we'll show you results from across a bunch of the different ones. We're going to get into the demographics so you can get a sense of who took the survey. Again, Dr. Martin stole some of my thunder on some of this, but we'll gloss over that quickly, and then we'll get into some of the actual perception data. So the responses over time, again, this is the highest response rate that we'd ever seen for the TWC, and the most total respondents ever, with 98% of schools meeting the minimum response rate for reporting, which is 40% for North Carolina. I will say the only state that has exceeded this response rate is Kentucky. They had a 90.9%, but keep in mind that they also only had about 45,000 educators, and we turned out almost 110, thanks to the hard work from Dr. Martin and her team, and even Superintendent Johnson pledging to do the Krispy Kreme challenge if we met 95%. Thought that was creative. I like that. Talking about the roles of the respondents for the survey, as you would expect, the largest portion of our sample or of our respondents is teachers. We also do survey principals, assistant principals, and other educators, including guidance counselors, psychologists, etc. When we're talking about the teacher experience of our respondents, this, again, being 91% of our educators is pretty representative of what you would expect to see across our state. But we've got 16% beginning teachers, and that's teachers in their first, second, or third year of teaching. And that's pretty consistent with what we also see across the country, where we typically see between 14 and 17% beginning teachers as a percentage of the respondents. So we're going to get into the survey results, the actual perception data, and again, we need to level set a little bit because most of the questions that are included on the survey are on a Likert agreement scale. And so for reporting out these figures, we look at the percent teachers agreeing to the items. And so the way that these calculations are done, teachers can respond, they strongly disagree, agree, or strongly agree to an item. And what we do is look at the percent who said they agree or strongly agree to get the percent rate of agreement for the item level. And then for each of the 8 constructs that we showed a few slides ago, we take those items that that construct is built of and create an average across those items to get our construct average. And again, the construct average, which we'll go over first, is kind of your 30,000-foot view, where you want to start and see if there are any hot spots that you want to take a look at, and then you dive in and look at the items that are associated within those constructs, and which we always recommend going down to look at the specifics and look at the actual items that are related. So these are the construct averages for 2018. We see at the top that use of time, 69% of our educators responding agreed that they had positive conditions related to the area of time. I will say that use of time is always the lowest rated construct for the TWC in North Carolina and across the country everywhere. Teachers always reporting that they could use a little more time, especially on all the items that are included in the construct of the time. Looking down through the rest of the constructs, you can see that more than 8 out of 10 teachers agree that they have positive teaching conditions in the other areas, with the exception of managing student conduct, which we're down at 77% there. To add another layer of context to this, we're going to look at this longitudinally. And so now we look at the use of time construct, and we see that we're at that 69%. That was the lowest out of all the constructs this year and in years past, and down 1% from 2016. But a reminder looking back to 2014 that we were at 65%. And so we're still at 4% higher than we were a couple years ago. So it's always good to keep in mind where we are in terms of growth and absolute achievement. So if we look across the rest of these, especially given that we have such a large group, it really takes a lot of teachers changing from agreeing about a specific condition to disagreeing to really move the needle. So we see a lot of pretty flat lines, with the exception of managing student conduct, where we see a slight downward trend, and we saw a 3% decrease from 2016 to 2018. And in a few slides, we will dive into that and look at a couple of the items that were driving that construct level decrease in the past 2 years. This graph is an excerpt from the 2016 outcome report, so connecting student achievement to teacher working conditions. And what we're looking at here is a graph of the construct averages for each of the schools that fall within the school performance grade, and how those relationships lay out. And we see in general, schools with highest school performance grades also have more positive teaching conditions compared to schools with lower school performance grades. So to get into a few of the items that fall into this managing student conduct construct, these are the 4 items that decrease the most, driving that construct average down. If we look in the top left-hand corner, students at the school follow rules of conduct. This is the item that decreased the most from 2016 to 2018. Falling 5%. On the left, or on the right-hand side, you'll see both of those items are related to consistent enforcement of rules of student conduct, both by teachers and school administrators, dropping 3 percentage points in each of those. And in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got a 4 percentage decrease in the faculty work in a school environment that is safe. So the next couple items are going to get into school leadership, and I've got a few different arrays of data that I felt would be useful for you that's not necessarily available on the web, so something a little special for you to get you through the rest of the afternoon. So this item, we ask respondents to indicate out of those 8 constructs which is the most important important aspect of their teaching conditions, most affecting their willingness to continue teaching at their current school. And we see 30% of respondents indicate that school leadership is the most important aspect. And that is a repeat of 2016 and 2014, and also repeated across the country in other states and other districts when you're looking at your public school teachers. This slide kind of puts an exclamation point on that finding. All of these items that you see at the bottom are related to school leadership and fall under that construct. And essentially what we've done is taken teachers who indicate that they have immediate professional plans to stay at their school, they're in the dark purple at the top, and compare them to teachers who indicate that they'd like to continue teaching in the classroom, but they'd like to move to another school or move to another district, taking that as a sign that they like being a teacher, but they're not happy or satisfied in their current school. And you can see that there's a pretty stark difference when you look at these school leadership items between those two groups, those who want to move to a different school and those who say they're happy at their school and they want to continue teaching there. This was a new item in 2018. We looked at student hunger, teachers to report out on the if their students were suffering from hunger issues in their classroom. And so we chose to array this by region to show that there are differences with this issue across the state. And we focused in on the two response categories where teachers start out indicating hunger is a problem for my students. The difference is the dark purple at the bottom is hunger is a problem for my students and it causes problems in my classroom and school. And the light pink or light purple above that is hunger is a problem for my students, but my school uses creative strategies to combat it. And I think that looking at this layout, you see that there's not a huge amount of variation in the bottom level where, so across the regions, you've got anywhere from 13 to 17% of teachers saying that their students suffer from hunger and it causes problems in their classroom. But then when you look at the bar above that, in the Northwest and the Western region in particular, you've got almost 60% of your educators saying, we've got creative strategies to handle this, right? And to me, that seems like a perhaps an opportunity for collaboration from school and district leaders from different regions, perhaps, to see what those strategies are and what things are working there. Also associated with student hunger, this is a graph that I pulled from the 2016 Student Achievement Report that will be released later this week and available on the website. This is comparing elementary schools that are high economically disadvantaged students, high percent FRL, and showing that if you improve the school teaching conditions in these schools, you can help to close those gaps of student achievement in terms, on this graph is the school performance grade. So in terms of that gap that's there, you can kind of move the needle by improving your school teaching conditions. The next section, we're going to look at some beginning teacher supports, in particular in relation to community support and involvement. The reason we chose to focus on this is that our research here in North Carolina, looking at student achievement and teacher working conditions, as well as across the country, we always find that the community support and involvement construct is most highly correlated with positive outcomes for students. And this is the array of teacher perceptions in 2018 of community support and involvement by year's experience. So you see that our first, second, and third, our beginning teachers have the poorest perceptions of the community support and involvement in their schools. This graph shows a couple of the items within the community support and involvement and shows the difference between our beginning teachers and our veteran teachers and their perceptions of the types of supports that they have around community support and involvement. And furthermore, our beginning teachers are asked to report how much the support they received as a beginning teacher influenced their practice. And these are the top three and the bottom three items that we chose from this that, and at the very top, we can see that enlisting the help of family members, parents, and or guardians is the area that is least focused on or least influential for those beginning teachers. And to me, it seems like perhaps an opportunity to have conversations with the mentors and say, maybe we can work a little bit more about focusing on engaging parents, getting engaged in the community, and making those early career teachers feel at home. The last two sections, we're going to look at technology and instruction. First, we're going to look at a few new items and some items just related to technology in public schools, and then we're going to look at some responses from the virtual public schools. So first of all, this item increased the most out of all the items on the survey in 2018. Of 5%, the reliability and speed of internet has increased. That's great news. We're still even at 80% on teachers have sufficient access to instructional technology. And these bottom two graphs, you might wonder why I have them up there, because they're both rated relatively highly, and there's no change that's of interest over the past 2 years. But if you look closely, they're both getting at the same thing. They're both getting at digital content and resources that teachers are using in instruction. And on the left-hand side, you see there's 96% of educators are reporting that they're using digital content and resources in their instruction. And on the right-hand side, you see only 85% of educators are saying that they have sufficient access to digital content and resources. And this slide shows how that differs across regions as well. But I think what we want to see is a closing of that gap, right, where teachers are having access to the sufficient resources. They're using digital resources, but I think there are conversations that probably need to happen at the local level of what are the digital resources that you don't have sufficient access to? Is this an IT issue? Do we need to have file share, things like that set up? There are just things that could be found out by having a conversation at the local level and understanding why that gap is there. So this was another new question in 2018, and we asked teachers to report whether or not they assign homework that requires internet access. And again, we've arrayed this by region to show that there are differences regionally in terms of educators assigning homework that requires internet access. But I think even more interesting is the difference that between the grade levels. And we see that more than 70% in most cases of high school instructors are assigning homework that includes internet access. And if we look at this by LEA, we see that there's even variation within regions. So some LEAs are assigning homework that requires internet access at a higher rate. And I think this is something to keep in mind and make sure that there's equity for students in terms of being able to do homework if it requires internet access. So the virtual public schools were surveyed for the second time. They were surveyed first in 2016. And they get asked, there are some common questions between the virtual public schools and the traditional public schools. But given that their school models look a lot different, there are a lot of questions that didn't apply, right? So there are a lot of questions that are specific just to the virtual public schools. These are the construct averages that we have for the virtual public schools. They're all the same, except there's no managing student conduct average. Instead, there's a communication average that you can see there at the bottom. And for VPS, teacher leadership, with the 82% of educators agreeing that they have the supports they need around teacher leadership, that was the lowest for the VPS. Here are a few items that actually do align between the two, between the traditional public schools and VPS. And the first two are related to class size and time and class assignments. And so we see the VPS are much more positive compared to the rest of the state in these terms, looking at time and classroom assignments. At the bottom, we see that the VPS are actually below the rest of the North Carolina schools in terms of their perceptions of, again, teacher autonomy and the teacher leadership issues. And so we're back at this, which aspect of your teaching conditions most affects your willingness to keep teaching at your school? So again, we already looked at the North Carolina teachers on the left, where school leadership was the most important aspect. But on the right, we see how that overlays with the VPS, and we see that use of time is by far the most important aspect of their teaching conditions for them, affecting them, their willingness to continue teaching at their school. Still, the top three are school leadership, use of time, and instructional practices in both cases, but just understanding that there is some different in context between those.
I'm struggling interpreting that one just a second.
Sure.
For example, professional development, it's a 2, all of North Carolina, 3 over here. And the question is, which aspect of your teaching conditions most affects your willingness to keep teaching at your school?
That's correct.
Is the lack of professional development being offered then I'm surprised it's low, but I'm not surprised if it's not being offered, because it doesn't keep, it doesn't help them in their willingness to stay at the school.
It's
so, I mean, every place I go, I hear we need more professional development.
And this item is set that you can only select one. So if you think about it in ranking the most important.
Teaching. The key is that
right.
The question is it's
at your school.
Thinking about teacher retention and what is retaining our teachers at their school. Right. So that's not to take that professional development is not important to teachers.
I got you. Okay,
yeah.
That's my question.
good question.
I don't think it'll be better.
And really, we like to focus on all of these items and highlight areas where there have been maybe some challenges in the past couple of years. But all in all, at the end of the day, across all grade levels surveyed, we've got nearly 9 out of 10 educators reporting that they overall their school is a good place to work and learn. And I think that's a testament to the work that you all do year in and year out. Does that mean that we can just say, great, we did a great job and walk away and feel happy about it? No, it means that we still need to dig into the data and find out where we can still get better, but feel good about the work that we are doing and we've done already.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A very thorough analysis. It's very good data that we collect every 2 years. And thank you to our state superintendent for putting a lot of energy and incentives into the initiative. Great job. And maybe you can return and do another analysis, another focus on the data.
So these other slides are?
These are just
This is just back up.
The slides in the appendix are the actual item levels. So if you want to go through and dig through those, we were only allotted a certain amount of time. So
for another presentation.
Perhaps.
The additional items. Thank you. That does conclude
Yeah,
ESOGs.
thank you, Dr. Oxendine. And thank you, board members and advisors, for your attention today. I appreciate your participation in the discussion on these important items. As you know, some of the issues certainly generate feedback from our constituents. I'm always pleased to know that people are paying attention to matters coming before the board and that they are a part of the input process on the issues. Board members, we have now completed our committee meetings. Tomorrow, we will vote on the action items that are included on this agenda. And before we vote to go into closed session, I recognize Mr. Greg Alcorn for a new business item. Mr. Alcorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This, from the Business Operations Committee, responsible for the financial part of it, and this is the reality of the budget cuts is a reality at this point. I've asked Adam Levinson to come up and give us a baseline or a framework that we can start overseeing this. I don't pretend to think that that the board is required to micromanage it, but to be some part of the shepherding process through this. Unlike last time.
And ultimately, we have to
Yes,
approve any.
Yeah. And Mr. Levinson, why don't you give us a little baseline? I think you've got 4 or 5 slides, and then we'll get ready to go.
Yes, sir. This is certainly brief. I'm happy to get to stand up. I'm sorry you don't get to. It's not a comment on the speakers. The information's been very good, but I know that you all have heard a lot, so I'm going to try to be brief. So this is an update. It is unfortunately not a happy update, as Mr. Alcorn suggested. Just to set the baseline and set the context, we've talked about this for about a year. Of course, the 17-18 reductions we talked about, you voted on, we've implemented. The 18-19 reductions that were in the budget have now essentially been affected. And that will be a total of just under $5.1 million. So none of that is specified in the budget. Last year there were, as you see, there are targeted reductions where there were specific positions, there were specific things that were to be cut, and then there was flexibility for the department and for you all to determine where to find the rest of the reductions. This year, all of that 5.1 is essentially at your discretion. To put it in context, over the last 10 years, the department has been reduced approximately $28.5 million, with 9.9 of that coming over the current year, and then next year, the 5.1. Looking to making the reductions, just as there was last year, there is language in the budget bill that restricts the areas that can be reduced or excludes them from the reduction. Some of those are outside of the core agency, the residential schools, the Center for Advancement of Teaching, and what we would call broadly pass-throughs, for instance, the monies that go to nonprofits such as communities and schools but are appropriated in your budget. Areas of the core agency that would be excluded or could not be reduced as part of this would be things funded by the Excellent Public Schools Act, such as the K-3 literacy area and efforts, School Connectivity Initiative, Innovative School District, and any items that were expansion items in the 17-19 budget. So those, of course, cover a range of things, but none of those things that were just given can be taken away as part of this. And so this just gives you a baseline of what you're working with, the basis for the reduction, the core agency budget that is not excluded from reduction. And you see all sources here. The focus, of course, is on the state column, where you have approximately $54 million. Just wanted to highlight here that that does include some things that were not technically excluded in the legislation, but really that we can't reduce or that you couldn't reduce in order to go towards the 5.1 million. That is, the expansion items have not been pulled out of here. That would have been a very painstaking exercise for this. And there's approximately $4 million for virtual public school that is state funding, but it's funding that comes into the department from the districts, from the state public school fund. So that's not something that really is eligible. So really you're working with approximately $44 million, and the $5 million reduction would therefore be about approximately 9% of the budget.
So what you did was you took the 53.9 at the bottom of the state, subtracted the 9 million that's over there in the yellow, and came up with the 44 million that is in consideration for this. What about the federal and the other?
So, of course, those funds are there and supporting many functions in the department, as you know. Last year, we were able to identify ways to be creative and shift some of that funding to continue some functions. And even with reductions in state funding, I assume that'll be part of the strategy again. But obviously, you cannot, none of the $5.1 million has to be from that state column and from the eligible state funds that are appropriated to the department.
It does?
Yes. Yes.
So the 54 million includes the expansion items? And
yes.
So we're really dealing with 44?
Yes, that's why this is relatively easy to produce using certain business rules to sort the budget, but to go in and pick out those items would have been a little bit more than it was worth for this exercise today.
Right. Okay. Other questions and comments?
On the first slide, it was broken down. 1 million for the performance audit that we just did. That apparently they chose not to follow those recommendations, but is the 1 million there a recurring item or a non-recurring item?
Yes, both of these reductions are recurring for the
So
total of 5.
Even though we were only required to spend it one time, we have to reduce it permanently from the budget. There's a one-time expenditure, I'm assuming, to the.
It was probably non-recurring.
There was a non-recurring appropriation to pay for the review,
Which was supposed to come up with at least $1 million worth of recommended reductions, but it didn't.
In addition to paying for the.
That's right.
That's right.
But of course they didn't, so.
It's $1 million out the window.
Wow. Okay.
Okay.
Wow, that was a waste of $1
All
million.
right. Hope that gave you a good enough framework. I think that concludes it at this point. Chairman Kobe.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Alcorn. We definitely have our work cut out for us. So if there is no additional business for the board at this time, I'll ask for a motion to go into closed session. I remind the audience that as soon as the closed session ends, we will return to open session and we'll adjourn immediately. We're gonna have a 10-minute break, so we will come back. We'll start closed session at 10 minutes past the hour. So, Mr. Davis, do you have a motion?
I move that the State Board of Education go into closed session to discuss specific personnel matters and to consult with our attorneys on attorney-client privilege matters, including the following cases: Heritage Collegiate Leadership Academy versus North Carolina State Board of Education, State of North Carolina versus Kinston Charter Academy, and Hoke County versus State of North Carolina and North Carolina Board of Education.
Motion by Mr. Davis, second by, yes, Mr. Keenan. All those in favor of the motion say aye. Anybody opposed, no. We will adjourn the open session right now and go into closed session. Again, what?
Seems like I didn't.
10-minute break.
Seems like I didn't hear an item. You didn't hear it? It's supposed to be in there.